Hi, everybody. It's Wendy Hernandez of Command the Courtroom. Welcome to another episode of the show. And today I'm really excited to introduce a guest to you, Lisa Ferentz. And let me tell you a little bit about Lisa. Lisa's a recognized expert in the strengths-based depathologized, can you help me with that? I can't
Yeah.
even say.
Depathologized.
Depathologized. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah.
Treatment of trauma, and has been in private practice for 34 years. She presents workshops and keynote addresses nationally and internationally. She's a clinical consultant to practitioners and mental health agencies in the United States, Canada, UK, and Ireland. She teaches. She's been an adjunct faculty member at the University of Maryland School of Social Work, University of Baltimore, Maryland, University of Maryland Department of Family Medicine, and is the founder of the Ferentz Institute, formerly known as the Institute for Advanced Psychotherapy Training and Education. And it's now in its 12th year, providing continuing education to mental health professionals and graduating over 1,400 clinicians from her 2 certificate programs in advanced trauma treatment. So Lisa's resume, her CV goes on. And I know that she's going to give us information about how you can find out more about her. But Lisa's really an accomplished practitioner, and she's going to shed some light today on trauma for all of us. So welcome, Lisa. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm delighted to be with you.
Thank you. So we had a lovely conversation before the holidays, and you shared during that conversation, and also just before we went live today, about your passion, which is helping educate not only lay people, survivors, and victims of trauma, but also people who are involved in the legal field, judges and attorneys who misunderstand trauma and what it's about. Can you tell my viewers a little bit about why you're passionate about educating?
Sure. I think if you're not able to look at victims of abusive, emotionally abusive, physically or sexually abusive relationships, if you're not able to look at them through a trauma-informed lens, then often what you see is going to be misleading. And this is often the byproduct of some of the dynamics that take place in abusive relationships, particularly relationships that have been emotionally and psychologically abusive, where there's the dynamic of gaslighting, where the abuser will say things and do things and then look you in the eye and completely deny saying or doing those things. So there's this kind of systematic, what I call perpetrator propaganda, which is this attempt on the part of the abuser to really make the victim feel like they are the crazy one. And when these folks show up, in a court of law for divorce proceeding, for custody issues, it's not unusual for the abuser to come across as very charismatic, very articulate, very charming, and frankly, for the victim to look somewhat confused, overwhelmed, anxious, frightened, even dissociative, meaning they're sort of spacey and a little bit, not fully present, kind of disconnected from what's going on. Sometimes that's literally because they have to be in the same room with a person who has abused them for years and years. And often, as you and I have talked about separately, Wendy, the idea that their own attorney does not always understand the impact that emotional abuse, verbal abuse, psychological, financial abuse can have on a victim. And by the time they land in that courtroom, they're often very lacking. The victim is very lacking in self-confidence. There's tremendous self-doubt. And that's kind of all the byproduct of those years of propaganda at the hands of their abuser. And again, if an attorney, if the judge, if they don't understand what they're seeing as being kind of the inevitable byproduct of that trauma, it's very easy to come to the conclusion that the crazy one is the victim.
Right.
Right?
Yeah,
That
totally.
they're making stuff up, that they're exaggerating. Here's the I don't want to be totally sexist about this, but I think you would agree more often than not, the victim is female and the abuser is male. But I have certainly also worked with men who were in very emotionally abusive relationships. And I think it's even more challenging for them when they show up in court because, a judge just assumes, hey, come on, you're a guy. How could she possibly have, taken advantage of you in any way or harmed you or, shamed you? So there's that sort of separate issue for the victim when they're male. But when they're female, it's not unusual for people who are not educated and not trauma informed to really misunderstand that presentation. And it's a presentation of anxiety and fear and really kind of the systematic chipping away at their sense of confidence and self-esteem.
So, and I have witnessed that in my practice for many years, Lisa. And I have to say, for many years, I didn't understand it. And I can relate to what you're saying about, the attorneys thinking that the victim was the crazy one. And it's just because there was a lack of education and the lack of understanding. So, I want to start, and I want to get to, and hopefully I don't forget, how an attorney and how a victim can start to rebuild their confidence. Well, maybe I should just ask it since I'm asking it, because a victim goes into a case, they're going forward in a divorce case or in a child custody case, and they've been, the victims for years of this propaganda, as you stated, and they find themselves in this position a little bit off balance, and it's not their fault. How can a person who's going through a case like this, with or without an attorney, start to rectify that, so they can hopefully make a better presentation to the judge? And I know it probably takes a lot of work, but are there any ideas or tips that you can share?
Yeah, my belief, obviously, and I come at this as a psychotherapist, but my belief is that for these folks who are going through something that is inherently traumatizing anyway, right? Going through a divorce, custody battle, fighting, for your rights financially, those things can be inherently traumatic. And so I think that the best approach is working both simultaneously with an attorney, but also being in therapy, if that's possible to do. Because all that ego strengthening and kind of rebuilding of one's self-esteem, and also, Wendy, getting a lot of very basic, what we call psychoeducation, because so many folks who have been abused for years in adult relationships also often have a childhood history of trauma. It's part of why they're able to stay for as long as they're able to stay in an abusive relationship. It's not because they're masochistic, because they're not. But unfortunately, some of those core dynamics of being treated disrespectfully, of being shamed, of being criticized, of being blamed, there's history behind those dynamics, right? They don't just start in the adult relationship with a boyfriend or with a spouse or a partner. And so there's a familiarity to that maltreatment, right? I want to emphasize, this is not about masochism. This is not anything that anybody enjoys. Nobody wants to be mistreated. Nobody wants to be disrespected. But if you've grown up in a family environment where on a daily basis you have been criticized and you have been shamed, it really makes sense that you're going to land in an adult relationship that's going to feel familiar. And that familiarity is going to have its exact same roots in maltreatment, a lack of respect, hypercriticism, and shaming. And so for me, therapy is such an essential ingredient because there's layers to this. It's not just about extricating yourself from an abusive adult relationship, back a sense of confidence and self-worth that your partner may have been stripping you of. It's going really deep and understanding the origins of that. And healing that and working through that. Now, I respect and understand not everybody can afford psychotherapy. That's a reality. Yeah. And so a resource that I do want to put out there that I really like to endorse and believe in, it's rooted in the 12-step model. So a lot of people know about AA or Al-Anon. So this is CoDA, CoDA, which stands for Codependence Anonymous. It's a free resource. In this day and age of COVID, you can attend meetings online, but there are also, countless live meetings. All people have to do is Google CoDA meetings, by zip code, and they'll be able to find meetings that are within their geographic location. It's a phenomenal program the same 12-step model, but really with a very serious emphasis on rebuilding ego strength and self-confidence and self-esteem, and helping victims to kind of let go of the ownership that they've been holding and taking around a failed relationship, or learning to not buy into that propaganda from the partner. Because one of the more insidious aspects of emotional abuse is when the partner attempts to convince the victim that everything that's going wrong in the abuser's life and in their relationship is in fact the victim's fault.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I've seen that a lot.
Yeah. And unfortunately, again, if you've got that prior history of abuse or neglect or maltreatment, it's very easy to buy into that propaganda that our marriage is failing because you're not doing enough of X. And you can fill in the blank because it could be 1,000 different things.
Yes.
You're not thin enough, you're not sexy enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not accommodating enough, you don't do enough for me, you don't listen to me enough. So there is this kind of overarching dynamic of taking on a lot of ownership and a lot of blame and a lot of shame for all the things that have gone wrong in that marriage, in that relationship. Abusers, sort of by and large, do not take responsibility. They don't take ownership for the role that they play. They'd much rather blame their partner for everything that's gone wrong in their professional life, in their personal life. And unfortunately, the victim kind of buys that propaganda. So CoDA meetings, Codependency Anonymous meetings, really focuses on extricating that victim from that sense of owning what they don't own, and really encourages them to take responsibility for their own healing, take responsibility for learning how to do their own compassionate, positive self-talk, something that I emphasize a lot as a therapist, to kind of counterbalance that shaming message that they've gotten for years and years from their abuser.
Okay.
So the therapy is essential. CoDA meetings are free. And then there are some great self-help books that people can access, maybe just starting with learning about the more subtle nuances of emotional abuse. There are a lot of books that have been written that really walk you through all of the kind of red flags and the cardinal features that are associated with an emotionally abusive relationship. And I have found that that's often the first step, is kind of opening the victim's eyes and helping them to understand that what they've been experiencing actually comes under the category of emotional abuse. Because emotional abuse, as you know, is more subtle at times, right?
Yes.
Than physical abuse, than sexual assault. And so it's trickier, it's more confusing for the victim to recognize that this is in fact abusive.
Yes. Yes. So on that note, when we talked in December, you started talking about the more implicit types of abuse. And is this what you're referring to?
Exactly. So starting with this idea of blaming the victim for all of the abuser's failures and problems, not taking any ownership or responsibility. But I'll walk you through a couple of other, I think, pretty universal dynamics that we often find in abusive, emotionally abusive, psychologically abusive relationships. There's a tremendous amount of isolating that emotionally abusive partners attempt to do. And that isolation can take the form of really wanting to separate the victim from their family, from friends, from clergy, from coworkers. And it's quite insidious when you think about it, because the more isolated a victim is, the more dependent they become on their abuser, and the less likely they are able to talk about the dynamics of their relationship with other people, the less access they have to networking and resourcing, and therefore the less likely it is that they're going to be able to get out of that relationship. So this is often presented under the guise of, I love you so much, and I just want it to be you and me. We don't need anybody else in our life, right? It's just all it needs to be is you and me. And so, see, initially, a lot of these abusive behaviors can come across as caring, as loving, as we have this amazing connection with each other. We don't need anybody else. But there really is this ulterior agenda and motive in emotionally abusive partners, which is to isolate, to get that person as disconnected as possible from other people who can even witness, what's going on in that relationship. And along the same lines of isolating, there's also, I think, an attempt to make the victim more and more financially dependent upon,
Mhm.
right? So this is the person who'll say to their partner, you don't need to work. You just stay home. I just want you to be happy at home. You don't have to have a career. If there's children involved, you just stay home and raise the kids. You don't need to pursue an advanced education. And again, on the surface, this seems very generous. I've
Right.
seen clients over the years who said, when I first got married, I felt so lucky
Yep.
because my husband kept saying, you don't need to get a master's degree. You don't need to have a career. I don't want you to have the stress of work. I just want you to do the things you want to do and have fun and take care of yourself. But again, there's this more nefarious agenda underneath it, which is making that person less and less marketable, in the work world. So
Yes.
that it makes it harder and harder for them when they do wake up and realize, I want out of this relationship. I've worked with many clients over the years who become terrified about the prospect of leaving because they don't have marketable skills,
Right.
right?
That's right.
They
Yeah.
don't have advanced education. They've been out of the workforce, for 10, 15 years. And so suddenly they have to compete with people their own age who have 15 years of experience under their belt. And it does absolutely make it harder for them to hire an attorney, for them to go to therapy, and for them to, try to actually divorce that person and be financially solvent on their own. And so that dynamic of isolating and increasing financial dependency, I think, is a very common manifestation of emotional psychological abuse. And then you have, again, this propaganda of what we actually call grooming
Mm.
in the mental health field, where in the earliest stages, and this is kind of a red flag for your listeners to be mindful of, in the earliest stages of the relationship, the abuser is not abusive. They're incredibly generous and charming, but they're grooming. They're what they're doing is attempting to win over the trust of that person, so that eventually they can weaponize and manipulate that trust. And how this can show up, and this is very in keeping with emotionally abusive relationships, is initially, again, saying, I care so much about you, so I'm going to text you 25 times, in a day, just to know how you're doing and where you are and what you're doing, right? And this is all under the pretense of, I care about you. I want to spend more and more time with you. So, maybe I'll show up at your workplace and I'll take you out to lunch every day. Or again, do me a favor, just text me when you get to wherever you're going. So it's initially, it feels like caring, but what this really is a trajectory into total control.
Wow.
Total
Wow.
control. And I've worked with people who've said to me, it reached the place in the relationship where I was required to text my partner like every 25 minutes.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. But again, when it's presented as, I want to make sure you're safe, I care deeply about you, the world is not an inherently safe place. So if you need me, I want to be able to know where you are at any given moment so that I can come running and protect you. Of course, none of that actually happens. It's just this wearing down of independence, and it's this increase in pretty pathological control. And you see that again with, let's just spend more and more time, you and me. We don't need to be with your friends. You don't need to spend why do you spend so much time with your mom? This is kind of how it begins. There's another very insidious kind of emotional and psychological abuse that, again, starts out seeming healthy and positive, but I call this unsolicited feedback. And the unsolicited feedback is presented as, I just want to help you improve. So, initially it starts off as compliments about your appearance and your successes and what you're doing and how you're dressing. And then very quickly it shifts into criticism.
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't wear that. That wasn't really your success. That was really your coworker's success. And again, this is all designed to undermine confidence and self-esteem. Now, it's always going to be presented to the victim as, I just want to help you to keep improving.
Yeah.
But when you step back and look at it, all of this feedback is not solicited, right? It's unsolicited. And it can get cruel in terms of the put downs and so it shows up as verbal abuse, but it's not just verbal. It shows up through a disgusted look. It shows up through disinterest, withdrawal, ridicule. And again, the real intention is to shame that victim, to create self-doubt, to destroy their confidence. The more a victim begins to doubt and question their fundamental worth, the more it's going to resonate to stay in an abusive relationship, right?
Oh, wow.
I'm not attractive. I'm not successful. I hear this constantly. Nobody else is going to want me. And so the fear becomes, I'm going to be alone. I'm going to wind up alone. Now I'm going to share with you my response to that as a therapist, which is, when you are in a toxic relationship, you are alone all the time.
Mm.
And so the difference is being with somebody that's toxic and abusive and having to expend tremendous energy trying to navigate that abuse and that trauma versus being on your own and not having the terrible stress and anxiety and fear and anger that accompanies being in an emotionally abusive or physically abusive relationship. So you are alone. You've been alone all this time, even though you're sleeping next to somebody. Because if you're sleeping next to somebody who abuses you, you're alone.
Yes.
That person doesn't have your back. That person is not your advocate. That person doesn't care about what happens to you. That person is narcissistic and selfish, and all they care about is using you and putting you down so they can feel better about themselves.
Yes.
So we're really talking about not going from a relationship to being alone and lonely. We're talking about going from being alone in an abusive relationship to being on your own and getting back your confidence.
That's right. That's right. That's really good awareness. And I'm glad you pointed that out, Lisa. So, and lots of bells are going off in my head because I think I was in an abusive relationship. Like, you're describing a lot of things that happened in that relationship, and it didn't work out by the grace of God for certain reasons. I'm so happy because all of this was happening in that relationship. So it's just riveting to me to hear you say all of this because it's like checking off boxes, check, check, check.
So first I want to say, I'm so sorry that you had to endure that because you never deserved that. And anybody who's listening to us, maybe having a similar experience one day where, lights are going on and bells are going off and they're checking the boxes. One of the things that I think is so important to emphasize is that as you begin to have this awareness that you are in and have been in an abusive relationship, it's so important to not ever beat yourself up about the fact that that's where you landed, whether you've been in that relationship for 2 months or for 22 years. And I've worked with both ends and everything in between. If you shame yourself, though, about the fact, that is, in fact, the relationship you were in, that's going to decrease the likelihood that you'll be able to move forward in life. And so you have to be incredibly compassionate with yourself when you have this realization and this recognition. It's very poignant. I've seen that moment occur in therapy countless times. And I appreciate and understand that when you've put so much effort and energy, when you've given your heart and your soul in an attempt to make a relationship work, and then you have the realization that this is an exercise in futility, this is an abusive relationship, no matter what you do, you're not going to be treated with the respect that you deserve. There's grief in that. There's loss in that. There's emotional pain in that. Again, other reasons why you deserve the support and benefit of therapy to process that, to heal from that, and to not blame yourself, because your worst mistake here is that you were loving and trusting.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And that's not anything to be ashamed of.
Not at all. Not at all. Well, that relationship was 25 years ago, and it was a short-ish relationship. But when it ended, it took me years to get myself back. I mean, years of grieving, and people were saying, okay, already, it's time to move on. It's time to move forward. Like, you've been going on about this. And, and I did it without the thought that I should get help, professional help. And I just kind of fumbled through it. So I'm so glad now we have YouTube and resources like you. Yeah, because I was a young 25-year-old and I just didn't know what to do except cry and eat and sleep and be depressed, and think I was not worth anything, really.
But, but underneath that, I will say to you, was extraordinary resiliency and, extraordinary courage and extraordinary strength. And again, I think that it's not unusual that initially women and men believe that when they do summon the courage to leave an abusive relationship, they often do assume that they have to do it on their own and by themselves. Mm-hmm. And again, part of that is the propaganda, the experience of isolation, the message that nobody's going to be interested in you or care about you or want to help you. That all is kind of part of the insidious propaganda that you get from an abuser. And there is also that shame, I shouldn't have been in that relationship. I should have known better, which is a cruel thing to say to yourself. But I think if you're leading from that idea, it's going to make you more reticent about reaching out for help. I want to normalize that millions, and I do mean millions of people, have suffered in abusive relationships because millions of people have been traumatized in childhood, in adolescence. And again, sometimes you don't have a prior history of trauma. You think you found Prince Charming, who was just a sociopath and remarkably good at grooming you and charming you. Mm-hmm. And it's not your fault that initially you believed that you were going to be with somebody very, very wonderful. And again, 99% of the time, abusive relationships do not start out abusive. In fact, they almost never start out abusive. And that's intentional on the part of the perpetrator, to be charming, to be loving, to be deeply concerned and interested, to be generous. But see, that's the reeling you in aspect. Exactly. Right? That's the grooming.
Yes.
And then once they believe that they have won over your trust, let's face it, when we trust somebody, we're vulnerable, mm-hmm. right? And so that vulnerability is either going to be treated in a very loving, caring, precious way. That would be a healthy relationship, or that vulnerability is going to be weaponized and exploited. And that's the onset of an abusive relationship. But I've yet to work with a man or a woman, and I've been doing this now for actually almost 37 years, who said, from day one, I knew that person was abusive. And I said, what the heck, I'll just stay or I'll change him.
Right.
That's not how it starts. And so you have to be fair to yourself and kind to yourself when you do have the realization, and sometimes you realize it weeks later and sometimes you realize it years later.
Yeah. So thank you for that. So question, because this came up for me and I know it comes up for a lot of my clients because we talk about it. And I think a lot of times people realize that there's something wrong with a relationship, and they may or may not think, okay, I'm in an abusive relationship here. Mm-hmm. But then there's this other side of it where they're thinking, but I know this person can be amazing because, he whisked me off to wherever and did this or that. And so they're going back and forth between this craziness and then who they think that the person can be, or who the person once showed them they can be. So do you have anything to say about that, or anything helpful? Yeah.
You've hit on something actually really, really important, Wendy, and that is this, that many times people stay much longer in an abusive relationship because they're either focused on the past when it was fabulous, right? Or they're focused on the future, where they hold the fantasy that, I've heard everything from, once he gets a better job, or, once his father dies, or once he totally stops drinking, he's going to be amazing. So in both of those cases, what the victim is focusing on is the past or the future. What they're not focusing on is the present reality. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things I urge my clients to do. Mm-hmm. We don't need to keep going back to how fabulous he was when you were dating. We shouldn't be focusing on how fabulous he's going to be, because we don't know, and that's fantasy. Let's talk about what is.
Okay.
Tell me how it feels in the now, in the present. And I think if you don't go there, if you're either going to be rooted in the past or rooted in the future, that is a very dangerous trap that keeps people in relationship way longer than they should be in relationship. If
Yes.
the more present focused you are, the more you face reality about how you're currently being treated and how you're currently feeling in the relationship. That's where the decision should be made from, not the past or the future.
Thank you. So when people get into that loop, and I don't know the technical term, I'm just talking from my own experience. When they get into that loop of thinking of the past, thinking of the past, thinking of the past, is there any tip or strategy that you can share to help them bring themselves to the present?
So part of the work that I do is parts related. And what I mean by that is my belief that when you're focusing on the past, one of the questions, this may or may not seem strange to you, but one of the questions I'll ask a client is, when you talk about how fabulous he was, how old do you feel? And it's kind of remarkable because the answer is usually younger. They're living in the past, and it's a younger part of them that is holding on to that kind of unrealistic hope about, this is going to be great and I'm going to get my needs met. And when I ask them to lead from their most adult self, that's what can get them back in the present reality. And that adult, is able to say, he abuses me, he hurts me, he shames me, he ridicules me. He doesn't let me use the money that I earned. Like, that's when you start to hear the narrative that's rooted in that present reality. So one of the things I do as a clinician, and people who are listening can do this even if they're not in therapy, is, whether you're journaling about the relationship, which I encourage people to do, gives you a little bit of distance, gives you a little bit of objectivity, whether you're talking to somebody you trust about the relationship, you want to be leading from your most adult self. And I'm going to even add to that, it's not just your adult self. It's what I call your wisest, most compassionate adult self. That's the part of all of us that sees things with the most lucidity, with the most clarity. It's a younger part of us that wants to hold on to the relationship because it's the younger part of us that is afraid of being alone. Yes. Or the younger part of us believes it's my fault that things are not going well. So ask yourself, how old do you feel when you're rationalizing and minimizing and justifying your partner's maltreatment, and you're trying to talk yourself into staying? It can be a very powerful question. Am I leading from my wisest, most compassionate adult self, or is this the scared kid in me?
Yes. Okay. I love it. So, okay. So, and to like kind of bring that around and then close it up. And I'm hoping that you'll come back because this has been amazing. And there were things that I wanted to get into that we didn't even go near. But so I have clients or potential clients come to me often, and they know they're in an abusive relationship. They know that they're in danger. They know their children are in danger, but they have been placed in this position of isolation, they're financially dependent on their partner, and they know they'll be better off at some point in the future, but they're terrified about what lies between what's happening right now and what they have to do to get to that happy point in the future where they're free of this person. So what would you say to the person who's fearing the divorce battle, the custody battle, the legal fees, whatever they're going to have to go through?
I think there's some fundamental sort of foundational pieces that if they're in place, it makes this process a little bit less traumatizing. What I tell my clients all the time, though, is if you're waiting to do this for a time when it's not going to be scary, difficult, upsetting, you're going to be waiting forever. It's going to be scary, difficult, upsetting. I think the difference is the amount of support that you bring into that equation. By and large, these actually are remarkably resilient people. If you've been able to navigate and survive being mistreated for 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, as far as I'm concerned, you're a remarkably resilient human being. So we're going to call upon that resiliency and that strength. But I do think the more alone you feel in that battle, the tougher it is. So, getting yourself involved in a support group. And aside from CoDA, there are many other chat rooms and online support groups, where people come together, where you can be inspired by somebody who's much further along in the process than you are. And that's powerful, to talk to other people who are further along, who can give you that sense of hope and optimism. I want to reiterate the absolute necessity of having an attorney like you who understands the nuances of trauma, understands the toll that it takes on the victim. If you don't have an attorney who understands that, you're going to be shamed in this process. You're going to be made to feel like you're the crazy one. You're going to actually feel like your attorney is aligning with your abuser, because they will align with your abuser, because your abuser is going to come across as articulate and charming, and you're going to come across as frazzled and overwhelmed and confused and weird. Yeah. So you have to align yourself with people who are trauma informed. Yes. That's essential. If you can't afford therapy, to do a CoDA meeting, which is free, to do an online chat room. I've written a number of books, and the one book that I do, if it's okay, that I do want to recommend, because I've gotten such very wonderful feedback from clients, because this book, it's basically a self-help book, but it's got all kinds of journal prompts and positive affirmations. The whole premise of the book is designed to increase self-confidence, self-esteem, self-compassion, and ego strength. And that's the foundation that you need in order to weather this scary and challenging process of extricating yourself from an abusive relationship. So the book is called Finding Your Ruby Slippers. And it comes from The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy spends the whole movie trying to find her way home. She thinks the wizard has the answer, right? Yeah. She gets to the Emerald City and she discovers that there is no wizard. And then Glinda, the good witch, says, Dorothy, look at your own feet. You've been wearing the ruby slippers all along.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That's my premise for this book, is that you have this inner wisdom. It needs to be accessed. It needs to be strengthened. And these journal prompts and these positive affirmations will help people to be able to get that ego strength. And I think that's where you have to start. I don't expect people to be able to leave abusive relationships if they have no self-worth, no self-confidence. If they're totally isolated, they're not going to leave. I get that. Yes. That's just too scary a proposition. So therapy is about starting with, or the self-help book, or the support group. It's about get back that ego strength. Get some education under your belt. Learn about what emotional abuse is. Learn about the insidiousness of grooming, and the manipulations that take place. Get smarter about that first. And then I think you have what you need to be able to move forward and free yourself from something that is emotionally and psychologically and physically dangerous, unsafe, and even lethal.
Yes, absolutely. So, gosh, this has been mind-blowing for me, frankly. Just the information that you've given, and it's only been 38 minutes. It's a lot of great information. Lisa, is there other work that you do that people can access if they love this interview, which I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to do? So,
sure. The easiest way that people can access free stuff that I've written and my books and other interviews is just to go to my website, which is theferentzinstitute.com. And everything is there, theferentzinstitute.com, all one word. And I don't know, maybe you can put that, on your...
We'll put the link on the show notes for sure.
That's great. That's all you need. And there are lots and lots of free resources there, so that people can get support. I think, it's important to end by saying, know that you're not alone. Really millions of people grapple with this. Know that there's nothing inherently wrong with you. Know that it does take incredible courage. If you have summoned the resiliency to navigate abuse all this time, you absolutely have what it takes to be freed of it and to live, a meaningful life. And regardless of what has happened to you in the past, you deserve to be loved, to be respected, and to be safe. That is your fundamental right as a human being.
Oh, it's a beautiful message, beautiful message. So you guys rewind and repeat, especially this whole interview, but especially that last part, because I agree wholeheartedly. And thank you so much, Lisa, for your time. I can't wait to have you back.
Wonderful. Good. I look forward to it as well. And thank you. I want to publicly thank you, because I think what you're doing is amazing and unbelievably important.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. And so for you out there listening, you got to keep on going, keep on trucking. I'll be back soon with another great interview. But until then, remember to get out there and command the courtroom, and give this video a thumbs up for sure, because I know Lisa gave a lot of great information. So be sure and give it a like. And we'll see you next time. Thanks.